In June 2022, the United States economy handed you a number: 9.1%. That was the official inflation rate, the highest in 40 years. The price of groceries, fuel, rent, utilities, all of it climbing faster than at any point since 1982. You felt it. You adjusted. You cut back. You made the quiet, private calculations that millions of households make when money gets tight. You moved things around. You told yourself it would pass. And you were told a story about why it was happening. The supply chains, the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, energy shocks. Story was consistent. The story was everywhere. Every press conference, every newspaper front page, every central bank statement pointed to the same explanation: forces beyond anyone's control. Global disruption. Nobody's fault, everyone's problem. Here is what that story left out. That same quarter, the same 3 months in which you were paying 9.1% more for everything, U.S. corporate profits were at record highs. Not recovering, not stabilizing, record highs. The Bureau of Economic Analysis had already confirmed that U.S. corporate after-tax profits rose 37% in 2021. 37%. The largest annual increase since the Federal Reserve began tracking corporate profits in 1948. In the same year that your real wages fell by 2.3%. Let that sink in. Your pay went up. Prices went up faster. Your purchasing power went down. And at the exact same time, on the other side of the ledger, profits went up by 37%. That is not a supply chain story. That is a different story entirely. The Kansas City Federal Reserve studied what was actually driving prices in 2021. They found that markup growth, the gap between what companies charge and what it costs them to produce, accounted for more than half of consumer price inflation that year. More than supply chains, more than wages, more than energy. The International Monetary Fund studied Europe and found the same pattern. Rising corporate profits accounted for almost half the increase in European inflation over 2 years. The ECB President Christine Lagarde said it out loud at a central banking conference in June 2023. Corporate profits, she said, were the single biggest factor driving prices in 2022. So here is the question you should be asking. If the inflation crisis was caused primarily by forces beyond anyone's control, why were profits at record highs while you were getting poorer? How does a crisis simultaneously devastate households and enrich corporations? And why did it take the head of the European Central Bank to say the word that nobody in government wanted to say? The word is greedflation. And this is the evidence. This is the money architect. And if this is the first time you are watching, the question I want you to answer in the comments right now is this: did you believe the supply chain story at the time? Tell me below. To understand what happened, you need to understand what inflation actually is. Not the political version. Not the campaign speech version. The mechanical version. Inflation is a measurement of how much more you are paying for the same basket of goods compared to the previous year. When the consumer price index rises 9.0%, it means the average American household is spending 9.1% more on the same things they bought the year before. Not food, on transport, energy. The numbers are not abstract. They are the difference between making rent and not making rent. Now, there are two basic ways prices can rise. The first is cost-push inflation. Your costs go up, so your prices go up. The raw materials cost more. Energy costs more. Shipping costs more. You pass those increases to the customer. This is the version you were told about. Supply chains disrupted by the pandemic. Container ships stranded outside ports. Energy prices spiking after Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. This was real. The supply disruption was real. Nobody is disputing that. The second is profit pull inflation. Your costs go up, but instead of passing on exactly what the cost increase demands, you pass on more. You raise your price by 15% when your costs only rose by 8%. You pocket the difference. Your margin expands. Not because you had to, because you could. Because everyone else was raising prices. Because customers were expecting prices to rise. Because the cover over genuine crisis gave you room to move. The question that matters is this: which one was actually driving the inflation crisis of 2021 to 2023? Most people, if asked, would say the first. Supply chains, energy, Ukraine, the unavoidable disruption. That is the story that was repeated loudly enough and often enough that it became the accepted explanation. But here is what the official data actually shows. In the first 6 quarters of the recovery from the pandemic recession, from mid-2020 through the end of 2021, labor costs contributed just 50% to price growth, well below their historic average. Non-labor input costs contributed above their historical average, consistent with genuine supply disruption. But the third component, profit margins, contributed at levels the Economic Policy Institute described as disproportionate. This pattern was not new. After the Great Recession of 2008, profit margins also rose sharply in the early recovery. Companies raised prices in the first year of a recovery in anticipation of higher future costs. The Kansas City Fed documented this across 11 recovery cycles dating back to 1948. It is a structural feature of how corporations behave when economic conditions shift and uncertainty rises. What was different this time was the scale and the duration, and the fact that real wages were falling at the same time. In every previous recovery studied by the Kansas City Fed, profit margins contributed heavily to inflation in year 1, then faded as labor costs took over. In 2021 and into 2022, the pattern looked similar on the surface. But the underlying numbers were not the same. Because in previous cycles, real wages were not declining at the same time that margins were expanding. In previous cycles, the two sides of the equation moved together. Workers got poorer temporarily. Then the recovery lifted wages in real terms. This time, workers got poorer and stayed poorer. The margins held. That is the context most people were never given. And it matters because it changes what the inflation crisis actually was. It was not simply bad luck. It was a structure. A documented, measurable structure in which the costs of disruption were distributed unequally. Most of the burden went down. Most of the benefit went up. Let us explain why. Here is the part nobody tells you. Corporations do not have a legal obligation to hold prices at cost, plus a reasonable margin. They have an obligation to shareholders. One obligation: maximize returns. When input costs rise, they raise prices to cover them. That is logical, that is expected. But when conditions allow, they raise prices beyond what costs demand. That is also legal. It is also rational from the perspective of the shareholder. And during a genuine crisis, when every price in the economy is moving, when consumers expect prices to be high, when the news is full of supply chain stories that explain away any suspicion, it is also invisible. This is the mechanism. Not fraud, not a conspiracy, a structure. The structure works like this. A genuine shock hits the economy. Costs rise. Companies raise prices to compensate. So far, costs push inflation. But then a second decision is made. The price rise is set above the actual cost increase. The margin widens. The company is now extracting above its costs. Not because it has to, but because the environment allows it. Customers cannot easily identify which portion of the price rise is justified and which is extraction. Regulators are not measuring it in real time. Financial press is focused on the macro numbers, not the margin arithmetic. So the extraction continues. Economists call this markup expansion. The Kansas City Federal Reserve calls it precisely that. The growth in the ratio between the price a firm charges and its marginal cost of production. When markups grow faster than historical norms during an inflationary period, it means companies are not just passing on costs. They are profiting from the crisis. And the Kansas City Fed's 2023 study confirmed it. Markup growth accounted for more than half of consumer price inflation in 2021. More than supply chains, more sandwiches, more than energy shocks. Markup expansion, the deliberate widening of the gap between cost and price, was the single largest driver of inflation that year. Now scale that finding globally. The IMF applied the same analytical lens to Europe. Their June 2023 report found that rising corporate profits accounted for almost half the increase in European inflation over the 2 years from 2021 to 2023. The ECB confirmed the same pattern in its own data. Christine Lagarde named it directly: profits. Not supply chains, not wages, not Ukraine alone. Profits were the primary engine. Here is what most people miss. The supply chain story was not wrong. Supply disruption was real. The energy shock was real. But those were the conditions. The extraction was the response to those conditions. Two things were happening simultaneously. One was reported constantly. The other was published in Federal Reserve research papers and IMF blog posts that most people never read. You were living through both. You were only told about one. Over the next sections, we are going to walk through the 10 mechanisms that made this extraction possible. Each one is documented. Each one has a named source. Each one answers a specific part of the question you should have been asked years ago. How does a crisis simultaneously devastate households and enrich corporations? Here is the answer. One mechanism at a time. Mechanism 1. The crisis was real. The cover it provided was priceless. Before 2020, if a consumer goods company raised its prices by 12% in a single year, analysts would ask hard questions. Margins would be scrutinized. There would be noise. There would be pressure. Price increases above inflation need justification in a stable environment. But in 2021 and 2022, the environment was not stable. Inflation was everywhere. Everything was more expensive. The narrative infrastructure was already built and running. Supply chains, ports, container costs, energy. The explanations were legitimate and omnipresent. And inside that noise, a price increase that went 2 percentage points beyond cost recovery was invisible. Nobody could separate the justified increase from the unjustified one. Not in real time. Not from the outside. This is the first mechanism. The genuine shock created cover for extraction that went beyond what the shock required. The crisis was real. The cover it provided to talk more than costs demanded. That was the opportunity. Economists at the Economic Policy Institute documented this in April 2022, analyzing Bureau of Economic Analysis data. In the first 6 quarters of the COVID recovery, profit margins contributed at disproportionately high levels to price growth, well above their historical average in prior recoveries. The supply disruption was genuine. The margin expansion on top of it was a choice. Mechanism 2. Prices go up fast. They come down slow, or not at all. There is an asymmetry built into the way corporations set prices. When input costs rise, prices rise quickly. When input costs fall, prices do not fall at the same speed. This is documented, and it has a name. Economists call it price stickiness, or asymmetric price adjustment. Companies raise fast and cut slow, which means that even after the supply shock eased, after shipping costs fell, after energy prices stabilized, after supply chains began to recover in late 2022, consumer prices did not return to where they had been. The Kansas City Fed noted this explicitly. Even after markup growth slowed from its 2021 peak, margins had not retreated to pre-pandemic norms. They stayed elevated, which means the extraction that occurred during the crisis did not reverse when the crisis conditions faded. The higher price became the new baseline. Pay attention to this number. Eurozone consumer goods companies reported average operating margins of 10.7% in 2022. That was 25% higher than their 2019 pre-pandemic level. By 2023, those margins had not returned to 2019 norms. The companies that raised prices during the crisis did not lower them when their costs fell back. The margin was kept. The extraction was permanent. Mechanism 3. Shareholders were watching, and they liked what they saw. In a quarterly earnings call, a CEO does not describe extracting margin from a crisis. The language is different. Pricing power, operational discipline, revenue optimization. These are the approved phrases. But the meaning, when you translate it back into ordinary English, is the same. We raised prices by more than our costs required, and shareholders rewarded us for it. And they did. U.S. corporate after-tax profits rose 37% year-over-year in 2021, the largest annual increase since the Federal Reserve began tracking in 1948. Not 37% above the pandemic-depressed 2020 baseline, 37% above 2019, the pre-pandemic comparison year. These were not recovery numbers. These were expansion numbers, record numbers, generated during the same period in which your real wage fell by 2.3%. The shareholder pressure to maintain those margins did not disappear when the crisis eased, which is why the margins did not disappear when the crisis eased. Mechanism 4. Market concentration meant you had nowhere else to go. A competitive market has a natural corrective mechanism. If one company raises prices beyond what costs justify, a competitor undercuts them. The customer moves. The overpriced company loses market share and is forced back toward cost-reflective pricing. This is how introductory economics describes markets. This is how politicians describe markets when they explain why price controls are unnecessary. But this corrective only works if competition actually exists at scale. In the decades before the pandemic, sector after sector in the US economy underwent significant consolidation. Airlines, pharmaceuticals, grocery retail, meat processing, banking. In each case, mergers and acquisitions reduced the number of meaningful competitors. By 2021, 4 companies controlled 80% of US beef processing. 4 airlines controlled 80% of domestic air travel. A handful of pharmaceutical distributors controlled the supply chain for most US drug distribution. When the inflation crisis hit, these concentrated sectors raised prices. And because there were only 3 or 4 players in each market, all facing the same input cost increases, all watching each other's pricing, the competitive corrective did not trigger. When there are 4 airlines and all 4 raise prices, you do not move to the 5th airline. There is no 5th airline. You pay, or you do not fly. This is not collusion in the legal sense. It does not require a phone call between CEOs. It requires only that each dominant player in a concentrated market recognized that maintaining elevated pricing is in their shared interest. The economists' term for this is oligopolistic coordination. The ordinary English term is nowhere to go. Mechanism 5. Inflation expectations became a self-fulfilling license. In 2021, the Federal Reserve made a judgment. The inflation spike was transitory. Supply chains would recover. Prices would normalize. Rate hikes were not yet necessary. This judgment, stated publicly and repeatedly by Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell throughout 2021, had a consequence that was not intended. If you are a business setting prices in 2021, and the Federal Reserve is publicly stating that inflation is temporary, and that it will not act aggressively, you have been told that prices can rise without immediate monetary tightening to push them back down. The window is open. The cost of raising prices above cost recovery is lower than it would be if aggressive rate hikes were imminent. By the time the Fed reversed course and began the most aggressive rate hiking cycle since the 1980s. Starting in March 2022, the margin expansion had already occurred. The prices were already set. The profits were already booked. The Fed's delayed response, however understandable given the genuine uncertainty of the period, extended the window in which extraction without consequence was possible. But it gets worse. When the rate hikes finally came, they worked by making borrowing more expensive. For corporations with strong balance sheets and access to bond markets, higher rates were manageable. Or households carrying variable rate mortgages, credit card debt, and auto loans. The rate hikes added a second financial burden on top of inflation that had already eroded purchasing power. Cure imposed additional costs on the people who had already borne the primary cost of the crisis. Mechanism 6. The narrative protection was institutional. The IMF published its Greedflation findings in June 2023. Christine Lagarde named corporate profits as the primary inflation driver in June 2023. Kansas City Fed published its markup study. The Groundwork Collaborative published its Commerce Department analysis. The Economic Policy Institute published its disproportionate profit margin data in April 2022. This information existed. It was published by credible, mainstream institutional sources. It was not suppressed. It was not classified. It was sitting in Federal Reserve research bulletins and IMF blog posts. And yet, the dominant public narrative throughout 2021, 2022, and most of 2023 remained supply chains, energy, and Ukraine. Not because those factors were absent, because the institutional data that quantified the profit component never received the SNE amplification as the supply chain story. One story had a press conference. The other had a research paper. You know which one you heard. Mechanism 7. Food and household goods companies led the extraction. Not all sectors extracted equally. The companies that showed the most dramatic margin expansion during the crisis were those selling things you cannot stop buying. Food, household goods, personal care products. The companies whose products are, in economic terms, inelastic. You can delay buying a car. You cannot delay buying food. Unilever, which manufactures hundreds of household brands across food, cleaning products, and personal care, reported profit margins in the high teens for 2022. Nestlé, the largest food company in the world by revenue, reported similarly elevated margins. Compare those numbers to Carrefour, the French supermarket chain that buys from companies like Unilever and Nestlé and sells to you. Carrefour's margin was approximately 3%. Food manufacturers, with pricing power over brands consumers recognize and trust, expanded margins aggressively. The retailers, competing on price for footfall, could not. This distinction matters for you. Because when food prices rose, the margin that was expanding was not primarily at the supermarket. It was at the manufacturer, the company whose name is on the product, the company you trusted because you had bought their products for 20 years. Mechanism 8. Workers were told wages were the problem. Here is what is genuinely uncomfortable to document. While corporate profit margins were hitting record highs and institutional researchers were publishing data showing profits as the primary inflation line driver, the dominant policy conversation was about wage growth. Central banks, including the Federal Reserve and the ECB, raised interest rates aggressively. Correctly, given the mandate, but the public justification was consistently framed around preventing a wage price spiral. The concern that rising wages would feed into rising prices and create a self-reinforcing loop. But the BLS data does not support that framing as the primary driver. Nominal wages rose 4.7% in 2021. Inflation rose 7.1%. Real wages fell 2.3%. Workers were losing purchasing power, not gaining it. The wage price spiral argument requires wages to be rising faster than prices. In 2021 and 2022, the opposite was happening. By March 2022, real wages were 3.3% below their March 2021 level despite nominal raises. Workers were told their pay demands were inflationary, while simultaneously earning less in real terms than the year before. And this is where the story changes. The long-run data makes this pattern undeniable. In the 1970s, the last major inflation crisis before this one, 70% of economic output went to employees. Just over 20% went to profits. By 2022, labor's share of economic output had fallen to 56%. Profits share had risen to one-third. This shift did not happen during the inflation crisis. It happened over 40 years of policy decisions, deregulation, and declining union density. The inflation crisis of 2021 to 2023 did not create the imbalance. It revealed it, and it accelerated it. Mechanism 9. The extraction was global, not just American. This was not a US-specific phenomenon. The IMF studied Europe. The ECB confirmed it for the Eurozone. Bloomberg Economics calculated that corporate profits generated more than two-thirds of Eurozone inflation at the end of 2022. The pattern was consistent across developed economies with similar market structures. Concentrated consumer goods sectors, reduced competitive pressure, inflation expectations providing cover. TSEM mechanism, the same data signature, on multiple continents simultaneously. The IMF phrased it precisely. Companies increased prices by more than the spiking costs of imported energy. More than, not equal to, more than. Mechanism 10. The political system had no language for this. In the United States Congress, in the European Parliament, in Westminster, the word greedflation appeared. Politicians used it in hearings. The Senate Budget Committee held a session in 2022 titled "Corporate Profits Are Soaring as Prices Rise." Are corporate greed and profiteering fueling inflation? The question was asked publicly, formally on the record. Nothing changed. Not because the evidence was absent. It was submitted. Not because the question was unreasonable. It was being asked by mainstream economists and central bank presidents. But because the mechanisms that would address profit-driven inflation, FOST, windfall, profit taxes, strengthened antitrust, enforcement, price transparency requirements, each collided with a different political obstacle. Antitrust enforcement requires politicals' will to dismantle concentrations of corporate power that have been building for 40 years and that are represented by significant lobbying operations.